Felix thought it was only a friendly hug, but for Jimin that single embrace quietly shattered everything he had never dared to confess. The applause had barely faded when Jimin froze in the middle of the backstage hallway, his breath caught somewhere between hope and disbelief as Felix wrapped both arms around another friend with an effortless smile that seemed innocent to everyone except him. The embrace lasted no more than a few seconds. It was warm, natural, carefree. To everyone watching, it was nothing more than a celebration after another successful performance. To Jimin, it felt like the sound of glass breaking inside his chest. He stood completely still, hidden behind a stack of equipment cases while the fluorescent lights above flickered softly against the polished floor. The laughter echoing through the corridor became strangely distant, as though someone had submerged his ears beneath cold water. Felix laughed first. "You did amazing," he said, patting his friend's back before finally stepping away. There was nothing romantic in his voice, nothing unusual. Felix had always been affectionate. He greeted people with bright smiles, playful shoulder nudges, spontaneous hugs, and encouraging words. Physical warmth was simply the language he had grown comfortable speaking, but love rarely understood ordinary logic. Jimin lowered his eyes before anyone could notice the faint tremble in them. His fingers tightened around the paper cup of coffee he had been carrying until the lid bent inward, a tiny crack, just enough for a few drops to spill across his hand. He barely noticed. The scent of roasted coffee mixed with the metallic smell of stage equipment and fresh paint from recently renovated dressing rooms. Somewhere nearby, staff members hurried across the hall while managers discussed tomorrow's schedule. Life continued exactly as it should. Only Jimin's world had quietly stopped moving. He turned away before Felix could see him. Every step toward the empty rehearsal room felt heavier than the last. Inside, silence greeted him like an old companion. The mirrors reflected dozens of lonely versions of himself standing beneath the white ceiling lights. He sat on the wooden floor without bothering to wipe away the coffee stain spreading across his sleeve. "Ridiculous," he whispered to himself. His voice echoed through the room. It was just a hug. The sentence sounded convincing. It should have been enough, but it wasn't, because the pain had never been about that single embrace. The hug merely uncovered feelings he had spent years hiding beneath smiles, jokes, and carefully measured distance. Jimin had promised himself long ago that friendship would always come first. Felix deserved uncomplicated happiness, not impossible confessions, not emotional burdens, certainly not someone who silently wished every hug belonged to him. Outside the rehearsal room, rain suddenly began tapping gently against the enormous glass windows overlooking the city. Gray clouds swallowed the evening skyline. The sound reminded Jimin of another rainy afternoon years earlier when Felix had first offered him an umbrella without asking questions. "You look like someone carrying the whole world." Felix had laughed then. "I can carry half if you want." It had been a joke. Felix probably didn't even remember saying it. Jimin remembered every single word. Memories had become dangerous that way. Tiny moments transformed into treasures because they were all he allowed himself to have. A knock interrupted his thoughts. The rehearsal room door opened slowly. Felix stepped inside with his usual bright expression, though concern quickly replaced his smile. "There you are." Jimin looked away. "Been looking everywhere." "Fine." Felix frowned. "You left so suddenly." "I just needed some quiet." Felix walked closer until he stood beside him. The room suddenly felt much smaller. "You don't look fine." Jimin forced a smile. "I'm just tired." Felix studied him carefully. One of Felix's quiet habits was watching people more closely than they realized. Beneath his cheerful personality hid someone unusually sensitive to emotional shifts. He noticed when voices became softer, when smiles lasted half a second too long, when eyes avoided eye contact. He noticed all of it, except the truth standing directly in front of him. Felix sat beside Jimin without speaking. Rain continued falling outside. For several minutes neither of them moved. Eventually Felix broke the silence. "You know, I worry about you sometimes." Jimin laughed weakly. "You worry about everyone." "I know." Felix smiled. "But you're different." Those words nearly destroyed every wall Jimin had built around himself. Different, such a small word, yet hope immediately tried convincing him it meant something more. Hope could be incredibly cruel. Felix stretched his arms above his head before letting out a tired sigh. "Feel like you've been carrying something alone." Jimin swallowed. "If I am, you don't have to." Sincerity in Felix's voice hurt far more than indifference ever could. Because kindness always sounded dangerously similar to love when heard by someone already in love. Jimin wanted to speak. He wanted to confess everything, how every compliment mattered, how every shared meal became another cherished memory, how every accidental touch stayed with him for days, how every friendly hug Felix gave someone else quietly reminded him of the distance he could never cross. Instead he simply smiled. "Be okay." Felix believed him, or perhaps he wanted to. He stood and reached out his hand. "Come on." Jimin accepted it. Felix pulled him to his feet with surprising strength before lightly dusting imaginary dirt from his shoulder. "There." Jimin laughed despite himself. "You always do that. You always forget to take care of yourself." A brief second they stood closer than usual, close enough for Jimin to notice the faint scent of vanilla shampoo lingering in Felix's hair, close enough to hear his calm breathing, close enough to imagine a future that would never exist. Felix smiled exactly as he smiled at everyone else, warm, gentle, safe. It was the same smile that made strangers feel welcome, the same smile that convinced lonely people they mattered. The same smile Jimin had accidentally mistaken for something uniquely his. As they walked back toward the others, Jimin quietly made a promise only he could hear. He would protect this friendship, even if it meant burying every feeling beneath years of silent smiles. Some loves were never meant to be confessed. Some hearts chose silence because losing friendship hurt less than risking everything. Felix walked beside him, talking excitedly about tomorrow's rehearsal, completely unaware that a single innocent hug had changed the shape of another person's heart forever. And Jimin listened carefully, smiling whenever Felix looked his way, carrying both the comfort of his closest friend and the quiet ache of loving someone who had never realized he was being loved at all. The following morning arrived wrapped in a pale gray sky, and the rain from the previous night had left the city smelling of wet pavement and fresh earth. Sunlight struggled through the clouds, casting a soft glow over the rehearsal studio where voices and footsteps gradually filled the quiet halls. Jimin arrived earlier than everyone else, he always did. It was another habit he had never explained. Arriving first gave him a few precious minutes to organize not only the practice room, but also his emotions before the laughter, conversations, and bright energy of the day swept through the building. He placed bottled water beside every chair, adjusted the speakers, and carefully wiped fingerprints from the mirrored wall. Anything to keep his hands busy, anything to stop thinking. The sound of the studio door sliding open made him glance up. Felix walked in carrying 2 paper bags from a nearby bakery. His blonde hair was still slightly damp from the morning drizzle, and his familiar smile appeared the moment their eyes met. "I knew you'd be here." Jimin forced an easy smile. "You know me too well. I also know you probably skipped breakfast." Felix placed one of the paper bags on the floor before pulling out a warm pastry wrapped in thin paper. "I bought your favorite." The sweet aroma of butter and cinnamon drifted through the room. Jimin stared at the pastry for a second longer than he intended. "You didn't have to, I wanted to." Those 3 words were simple, completely innocent, yet they echoed painfully inside Jimin's heart. He accepted the pastry with both hands. "Thank you," Felix grinned. "There it is." "What? That smile?" Jimin instinctively touched his own face. "I wasn't smiling." "You were," Felix laughed softly. "You always smile differently when you're genuinely happy." Jimin looked away before Felix could notice the warmth rising to his cheeks, if only Felix knew. The smile wasn't because of the pastry. It was because Felix had remembered something so small, a favorite breakfast, a tiny detail from months ago. For Felix, remembering people came naturally. For Jimin, being remembered felt dangerously special. One by one the others entered the studio, bringing noise and conversation with them. Music soon filled the room. Practice began. Hours passed beneath bright ceiling lights as choreography repeated again and again. Sweat soaked through shirts, breathing grew heavier, and the polished wooden floor reflected exhausted figures moving in perfect synchronization. During a short break, everyone collapsed wherever they could find space. Some stretched, others checked their phones. Felix wandered toward the vending machines with his usual boundless energy. "Anyone want drinks?" Several voices answered at once. Jimin remained seated against the mirror, wiping sweat from his forehead with a towel. "You?" Felix asked. "The usual," Jimin nodded. "Please." A few minutes later, Felix returned, balancing several cans in his arms. As he handed them out, one slipped from his fingers. Without thinking, both he and Jimin reached for it. Their hands met, just for an instant, warm skin against warm skin. Neither moved. The cold aluminum can rolled across the floor with a hollow metallic sound. Felix chuckled. "We're both clumsy." Jimin quietly withdrew his hand. "Looks like it." No one else noticed. To everyone around them, it was nothing. Jimin, even the briefest touch lingered long after it ended. The afternoon continued until the manager announced an early finish. "You all worked hard today," he said. "Take the evening off." Cheers immediately filled the room. Plans formed almost instantly. "Dinner, movie, let's go together." Felix looked toward Jimin. Coming. Before Jimin could answer, another friend cheerfully threw an arm around Felix's shoulders. "You promised you'd help me shop today." "Oh." Felix rubbed the back of his neck. "Right. I did." He turned back to Jimin with an apologetic smile. "Maybe next time." Jimin's expression never changed. "Of course." His voice remained calm. "Too calm." "No problem." Felix smiled with obvious relief. "Make it up to you. You don't have to." But Felix was already being pulled toward the exit by the others, laughing as they argued about where to eat first. Within seconds the hallway emptied. Silence settled over the practice room once again. Jimin remained exactly where he was. His sports bag rested beside his feet. The unopened drink Felix had bought him was still cold in his hand. He stared at it quietly. The disappointment wasn't rational. Felix had done absolutely nothing wrong. He had simply kept another promise. Yet somehow Jimin felt as though he had been left behind. Again, he hated himself for thinking that way. Possessiveness had no place inside friendship. It was unfair, selfish, and completely unlike the person he wanted to be. With a quiet sigh, he slipped the unopened drink into his bag and left the building alone. Outside, the evening air carried the scent of rain once more. The sidewalk shimmered beneath rows of streetlights, reflecting gold across puddles that trembled whenever passing cars disturbed the water. Jimin walked without deciding where he was going. The city buzzed around him, alive with conversations, music spilling from cafes, and the distant rumble of trains, yet he felt strangely separate from all of it. His phone vibrated. A message from Felix appeared. "Don't forget to eat dinner, and thank you for practicing with me today. You always make me feel more confident." Jimin stopped walking. His thumb hovered above the keyboard. He wanted to reply immediately. He wanted to tell Felix that those words meant more than Felix could ever imagine. Instead, after several long moments, he simply typed, "You too." Have fun. A few seconds later another message arrived. Always, see you tomorrow. Smiling face with smiling eyes. Jimin smiled faintly, a real smile, soft, bittersweet. Because even though every conversation ended with kindness, every kindness also reminded him of the invisible line he refused to cross. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and continued walking beneath the quiet rain, carrying both gratitude and heartbreak in equal measure, slowly learning that sometimes the hardest person to forgive was not the one who unknowingly hurt you, but yourself for hoping that ordinary acts of friendship could one day become something more. The next few days slipped by with an almost deceptive sense of normalcy. Schedules grew busier, rehearsals stretched later into the night, and cameras followed them through interviews, dance practices, and promotional events. From the outside, everything looked exactly as it always had. Felix was bright, energetic, and endlessly kind. Jimin smiled at the right moments, laughed at the right jokes, and never allowed the quiet storm inside him to reach the surface. Only he knew how exhausting that performance had become. One evening, after nearly 10 hours of practice, the choreographer finally clapped his hands. "That's enough for today. Excellent work, everyone." A chorus of relieved sighs filled the room. Some members collapsed onto the wooden floor while others immediately searched for their phones. Sweat glistened under the studio lights and the air smelled of warm wood, bottled water, and hard work. Jimin sat against the mirrored wall, his breathing still uneven. He closed his eyes for only a second. When he opened them again, Felix was sitting beside him. "You pushed yourself too hard today." Jimin smiled faintly. "I could say the same about you." Felix laughed, wiping sweat from his forehead with a towel. "I know." For a while they simply listened to the quiet hum of the air conditioner. Moments like these had always been Jimin's favorite. No cameras, no audience, no expectations, just silence shared between two friends. Felix suddenly leaned back on his hands and stared at the ceiling. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When was the last time you were really happy?" The question caught Jimin off guard. He searched for an answer but found only memories, rain, a shared umbrella, a pastry on a quiet morning. A message reminding him to eat. Every happy memory seemed to have Felix standing somewhere inside it. "I don't know," Jimin admitted. Felix turned to look at him. "Been smiling less lately." "Just been tired. You always say that." Jimin looked away because it was easier than telling the truth. Felix sighed quietly. "I wish people would tell me when they're hurting." Jimin's heartbeat quickened. "I don't like seeing someone I care about suffer alone." Those words settled heavily between them. Someone I care about. Jimin knew exactly what Felix meant. Friendship, concern, nothing more, yet hearing them still filled his chest with both warmth and sorrow. Before either of them could continue, one of the staff members entered the room. "We're taking a group photo outside before everyone leaves." Felix stood immediately. "Come on." The evening sky had finally cleared. The rain clouds were gone, revealing a deep navy sky where the first stars quietly appeared. The group gathered on the rooftop terrace. City lights sparkled below like thousands of tiny lanterns. Everyone laughed while trying to decide where to stand. As usual, Felix drifted naturally toward the center, greeting everyone with easy conversation. The photographer raised his camera. Closer together, everyone shuffled into place. Without thinking, Felix stepped backward until his shoulder lightly brushed against Jimin's. "You okay here?" Felix asked quietly. Jimin nodded. "Yeah." Camera flashed, then again. Between photographs, Felix leaned slightly closer. "Been quiet all week." "Listening." "That's not the same thing." Jimin smiled. "It isn't." Photographer laughed. "One more, make it natural." Almost instantly everyone relaxed. Some laughed, others made playful expressions. Felix instinctively rested his hand against Jimin's shoulder. It was a simple gesture, comfortable, friendly, completely natural. Jimin felt his heart tight. He wished time would stop, just for 1 minute. Just long enough to believe that this closeness belonged only to them. The camera clicked. That single photograph captured smiles no one would question. Months later, people would admire it online, commenting on how close everyone looked. No one would ever guess that one smile concealed a heart quietly breaking. After the photo session ended, everyone began leaving in small groups. Jimin lingered behind. The cool night breeze brushed gently across the rooftop. Below, traffic moved like ribbons of light through the sleeping city. He rested his hands on the railing. "You always come here when you're thinking." Felix's voice came from behind him. Jimin turned. "I didn't know you noticed." Felix smiled. "Notice more than people think." He stepped beside Jimin, looking out over the skyline. "When I'm confused, I like looking at the city." "Why?" "Because every light belongs to someone's story." Jimin followed his gaze. Thousands of glowing windows stretched into the distance. "So many people," Felix continued softly. "Some are celebrating, some are crying, some are probably falling in love." The last sentence made Jimin's chest ache. "And some," Jimin said quietly, "are learning to let go." Felix glanced at him with a thoughtful expression. "That sound lonely." "Maybe." Neither of them spoke again. The wind carried the distant sound of music from a nearby street festival. For the first time in days, Jimin felt strangely calm. Not because the pain had disappeared. It hadn't, but because he was beginning to understand something he had spent months refusing to accept. Love did not become less real simply because it remained unspoken. And friendship did not become less precious simply because it could never become love. Standing beside Felix beneath the quiet stars, Jimin made another silent promise. He would stop measuring every smile, every touch, every kind word. He would treasure them for what they truly were, not for what he wished they could become. Beside him, Felix smiled peacefully, completely unaware that the person standing only a few inches away had just begun the long, difficult journey of healing a heart that had loved him in silence.
Morning arrived with golden sunlight spilling through the practice studio windows, painting long streaks across the polished wooden floor. For the first time in weeks, Jimin felt that the weight inside his chest had become quieter. It had not disappeared, but it no longer screamed. It simply existed, like an old scar that still ached whenever the weather changed. He arrived carrying 2 cups of iced coffee, one for himself, one for Felix. The gesture surprised even him. For so long, every act of kindness had been tangled with hidden expectations, even if he had never admitted it. This morning felt different. He wanted to give without silently hopping for something in return. The studio door slid open. Felix entered, humming softly under his breath before stopping in surprise. "Is that for me?" Jimin nodded. "I remembered your favorite." Felix's eyes brightened. "You remembered? You always order the same one." Felix accepted the cup with both hands, smiling so brightly that the morning itself seemed warmer. "Thank you." They sat together before rehearsal began. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It was peaceful, the kind of silence shared by people who trusted each other's presence without needing constant conversation. Felix took a sip of his coffee. "Changed." Jimin looked at him curiously. "Have I?" "A little." "A good way?" Felix laughed. "I think so." Jimin smiled. "Been thinking a lot." "Dangerous." "Really is." They both laughed, and the sound echoed gently through the empty studio. As rehearsals began, everyone noticed something different about Jimin. He laughed more naturally. He no longer forced conversations, nor did he withdraw into himself whenever Felix spoke with someone else. Instead, he focused on the music, the choreography, and the people around him. It wasn't that his feelings had disappeared. He had simply stopped allowing them to control every moment of his life. Late that afternoon, after practice ended, Felix approached him again. "I'm visiting my grandmother tomorrow." "That sounds nice." "Always asks about you." Jimin blinked in surprise. "About me?" Felix nodded. "I told her you always make sure everyone feels included." Jimin chuckled softly. "I don't think I've done anything special." "You have." Felix looked at him with complete sincerity. "You probably don't realize it, but when someone is having a difficult day, you're always the first person to notice." Jimin lowered his gaze. He wondered if Felix realized how ironic those words were. He had noticed everyone else's pain. He had simply hidden his own. "My grandmother says people like that usually carry heavy hearts." Jimin smiled sadly. "She's wise." "Is." Felix hesitated before continuing. "She also says that someday, someone will notice the people who spend their lives noticing everyone else." The sentence lingered quietly between them. Jimin felt an unexpected warmth spread through his chest, not because he imagined hidden meaning, not because he believed Felix was confessing something, simply because those words reminded him that kindness was never wasted, even when it went unnoticed. That evening, the group gathered for dinner at a small restaurant near the studio. Laughter flowed easily as stories from old performances turned into playful arguments about forgotten choreography and embarrassing mistakes. Jimin found himself laughing until tears formed in his eyes. Felix pointed at him across the table. "There you are." "What?" "That smile again." Jimin shook his head, laughing. "You really pay attention." "I always will." Words were spoken lightly, wrapped inside friendship, carrying no promise beyond that. And this time, Jimin accepted them exactly as they were. On the walk home, the city shimmered beneath rows of glowing streetlights. The air carried the scent of fresh rain even though the sky was clear. Their footsteps echoed softly along the quiet sidewalk. Felix stretched his arms. "Glad we're friends." Jimin looked ahead instead of at him. "So am I." For the first time, those words didn't hurt. They felt honest. They felt enough. Jimin finally understood that loving someone did not always mean holding on until they loved you back. Sometimes love became gentler. It learned to step aside without disappearing, transforming itself into gratitude for the moments shared rather than sorrow for the future that would never come. As they reached the corner where their paths separated, Felix waved with his usual bright smile before walking toward the waiting car. Jimin watched him leave without tears. The ache remained, but it no longer defined him. He turned toward home, carrying memories instead of regrets, and with every step, the quiet hope of his heart slowly transformed into something stronger than longing. It became peace. Weeks passed, and autumn quietly settled over the city. The trees lining the streets outside the practice building slowly exchanged their deep green leaves for shades of amber and crimson. Every morning, a cool breeze swept through the sidewalks, carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves and the distant aroma of freshly brewed coffee from the cafes nearby. Life had found its rhythm again. Rehearsals, recordings, interviews, late-night conversations, everything continued, and Jimin learned to move forward with it. His feelings for Felix had not vanished, but they had become quieter, no longer demanding to be heard every waking moment. Instead, they rested silently in a corner of his heart, becoming a memory he chose to carry with tenderness rather than regret. One afternoon, after finishing dance practice earlier than expected, everyone decided to spend a rare free evening together. "Let's go somewhere without cameras," one of the members suggested. "A picnic," another replied. Felix's face immediately lit up. "There's a park by the river," everyone agreed. By sunset, they had spread blankets across the soft grass overlooking the water. The river reflected streaks of orange and pink as the sun slowly disappeared behind the skyline. Someone played soft music through a portable speaker. Another unpacked sandwiches and fruit. For the first time in months, there was no pressure to perform. Only laughter, only friendship. Felix sat beside Jimin while peeling an orange. "Been smiling a lot lately." Jimin accepted one of the orange slices. "I guess I've had a reason to." Felix tilted his head, looked toward the river. "I realized I spent too much time wishing life were different. Now I'm trying to appreciate the life I already have." Felix smiled warmly, like that. Conversation drifted naturally to childhood memories. Everyone shared stories, some embarrassing, some hilarious, some surprisingly emotional. When it was Jimin's turn, he hesitated. "I used to think people only stayed if you were useful." The laughter faded. Felix looked at him with quiet concern. "So I worked hard all the time." Jimin continued softly. "I thought if I became someone everyone needed, no one would leave." The evening breeze stirred the grass around them. No one interrupted. "Been afraid of being forgotten for as long as I can remember." Felix lowered his eyes. "I don't think anyone here could ever forget you." Jimin smiled. "Thank you." He believed him, not because he hoped for something more, but because true friends often knew exactly how to heal wounds they had never caused. As darkness settled over the park, tiny lights illuminated the riverside walkway. Someone suggested taking photographs. Everyone gathered together. This time, Jimin didn't worry about where Felix stood. He simply laughed when someone made a ridiculous face. The camera flashed several times. The photographs captured genuine happiness, not perfect happiness, just honest happiness. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Felix sat alone in his apartment. He scrolled through the photos from the picnic, smiling at each one. Then his expression slowly changed. His thumb stopped on a picture of Jimin looking toward the river. There was something in that expression. A quiet sadness, peaceful yet strangely lonely. Felix remembered every conversation they had shared over the past few months. The moments when Jimin had suddenly fallen silent. The tired smiles, the way he always claimed he was fine. Rooftop, the rehearsal room, the rainy evening. A faint feeling settled inside Felix's chest. Not love, not certainty. Simply the uncomfortable realization that perhaps there had always been something he had failed to understand. He leaned back against the sofa and closed his eyes. "I hope you're really okay," he whispered into the quiet room. At that very moment, Jimin stood on the balcony of his own apartment, looking up at the clear night sky. The stars shimmered softly above the sleeping city. He took a slow breath. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't asking the universe to change someone's heart. He wasn't asking for impossible miracles. Instead, he whispered a different wish. "I hope he stays happy." Words surprised even him. There was no bitterness in them, no hidden sorrow, only sincere affection. Sometimes the purest form of love was not about being chosen. It was about quietly hoping that the person you loved would find every happiness the world could offer, even if that happiness was found on a path where you walked only as a treasured friend. And somehow, beneath the same sky filled with silent stars, That realization finally made Jimin's heart feel lighter than it had in a very long time. Winter arrived quietly. The first snow of the season settled across the rooftops before dawn, turning the city into a landscape of silver and white. The streets that were usually crowded with hurried footsteps became softer, wrapped in the muffled silence that only fresh snow could bring. Jimin stood by the studio window, watching delicate flakes drift through the pale morning sky. It always feels like the world starts over when it snows. He hadn't realized he had spoken aloud until Felix answered from behind him. I was about to say the same thing. Jimin turned, smiling. Early, Felix lifted 2 steaming cups of hot chocolate. I figured someone would be standing here. You know me too well. Felix laughed as he handed him one of the cups. And you always accept free drinks. And chuckled. I'd be foolish not to. Warmth of the cup spread through his cold hands. Outside, snow continued falling. Inside, the studio slowly filled with familiar voices. That day's rehearsal was shorter than usual because everyone would soon leave for a brief holiday break. The announcement was met with cheers. I can't wait to sleep for 3 days, someone joked. I can't wait to eat everything, another replied. Laughter echoed through the room. Felix glanced toward Jimin. What about you? Jimin thought for a moment. I think I'll just rest. You deserve it. Those words felt simple now, comforting, no longer painful. When rehearsal ended, everyone exchanged holiday wishes before leaving one by one. Soon only Felix and Jimin remained. The studio felt unusually quiet. The mirrors reflected the empty room where they had spent countless hours practicing together. Felix walked toward the center of the room and slowly spun once, his sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. It feels strange when it's empty. It does. Felix looked around thoughtfully. We've spent so much time here. Have, you know, Felix hesitated. Been thinking about something. Jimin waited. There was a time when I thought you were drifting away from me. Jimin's expression softened. I wasn't. I know that now. Felix smiled gently. I just didn't understand what you were carrying. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jimin quietly replied, sometimes I didn't understand it either. Felix nodded as if that answer made perfect sense. I guess everyone has battles they don't talk about. They do. Felix stepped closer. I'm glad you stayed. Jimin looked into his friend's eyes. So am I. There was no hidden meaning, no silent plea, only gratitude. Felix extended his hand with a grin. Friends, Jimin laughed. Weren't we already? We were. Then why ask? Because I wanted to hear you say it. Jimin shook his hand firmly. We're friends. Felix smiled with the same warmth that had always defined him, but this time Jimin saw it clearly for what it was. A gift freely given without promises it could never keep. As they left the studio together, snow crunched softly beneath their shoes. The city glowed beneath strings of winter lights and people hurried past carrying gifts and scarves wrapped tightly around their necks. Halfway down the sidewalk, Felix suddenly stopped. Wait. Jimin turned. Felix brushed a small snowflake from Jimin's hair. There. Jimin laughed. Thanks. No problem. They continued walking. Neither noticed an elderly woman sitting on a nearby park bench, watching them with a gentle smile. When they passed, she quietly said, the strongest friendships are the ones that survive misunderstandings of the heart. Both of them slowed. Felix smiled politely. Think you're right. Woman nodded before returning her gaze to the falling snow. Jimin looked up at the gray winter sky. Months ago, he would have mistaken that small gesture. The snowflake brushed from his hair for another reason to hope. Now he simply appreciated it as kindness. And somehow that made it even more beautiful. As they reached the intersection where their paths separated, Felix waved. Happy holidays, Jimin. Happy holidays, Felix. They walked in opposite directions. Neither looked back, neither needed to, because some stories were never meant to end with a confession or a grand romance. Some stories ended with two people choosing to protect the bond that had carried them through loneliness, misunderstanding, and quiet heartbreak. The love Jimin had once hidden did not disappear. It changed. It became gratitude for every shared laugh, every conversation after rehearsals, every rainy afternoon, every warm cup of coffee, and every ordinary moment that had quietly shaped his heart. And as snow continued to fall over the sleeping city, Jimin realized that healing was not the moment when love ended. Healing was the moment when love no longer hurt.